Hey guys, Kevin Bupp here, and welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Investing for Cash Flow podcast. Our mission is to help you build and maintain massive amounts of cash flow through income-producing real estate investments. And our guest for this week's show is a real estate investment expert, Steve Olson. Now, Steve has been in the real estate game since 2002. He completed his first real estate deal while still in college and decided to pursue investing as a full-time career at that point. Steve is currently the director of sales for FIG, also known as Fourplex Investment Group, a national real estate investment group that specializes in the development and sales of large-scale fourplex properties across many of the country's hottest markets. And so with that, guys, it's my honor to welcome Steve Olson to the show. Steve, how you doing today?
Doing great. Honored to be here as well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited to dig into your background personally, but also talk about FIG and exactly what it is you guys do over there. So maybe we'll start with you, Steve. Maybe give us a little bit more insight as to kind of your introduction to real estate. Looks like you started actually doing deals back in college, and so maybe let's go back in time a little bit. Tell us a little bit more about that, and ultimately, and then we'll dive into FIG a little bit.
Well, it was a great start into the real estate business for me. Kind of unique, but at the time, I was in college working my way through, and I had the bright idea that I was going to be an attorney. I've since dodged that bullet, luckily, but that's what I thought I wanted to do, right? We all thought we wanted to do something when we were younger. And I was in college and I was working my way through, and I happened to land a part-time job. Many of the listeners probably know the name Robert Allen, right? One of the very first real estate gurus out there after like Carlton Sheets, right? So I was working in his administrative side of things, shipping boxes and taking phone calls and things like that. And, it was funny. It just kind of shows how everybody has to get there on their own time mentally. But I was down the hall from these real estate coaches that were coaching people on the phone about how to buy a foreclosure or whatever. And by the way, it was a lot easier back then because the competition just, I don't think it was 100th of what it is now.
Sure.
But I thought, if I go do a couple of real estate deals, I could pay for law school. And I didn't think that, hey, if you did a couple of real estate deals, you made a few $100,000, why are you going to law school, right? But, like I said, we all got to make that connection. So eventually I did. I dropped out with 12 credits left, and for those of the listeners that are twitching about that, I did finish later on, but I started real estate and I've been involved in it one way or the other ever since then.
Okay, cool. Very cool. And you mentioned Robert Allen. I got my start back in 1999, and there was only a handful of names back then, Robert Allen being one of them. He was famous for getting dropped off. I believe it was San Francisco, right, with you fill in the blanks here. Was it $100 in his pocket or a few $100s in his pocket, and ultimately, buying, a few properties with no money down over a period of time. So again, fill in the blanks there. It's been quite some time since I recall that story, but long story short, I've actually had the opportunity to meet Robert Allen a few months back in Key West at an event. And then ultimately, I got my start by going to a Ron LeGrand seminar back in 1990.
Oh, yeah.
Which is, he was one of the other big names, Ron LeGrand, Robert Allen, and then Carlton Sheets, probably really the three primary folks back in the day.
Right before Kiyosaki came on the scene.
That's it. In fact, I was at an event yesterday as we record this, and had the opportunity to meet Ron LeGrand in person, which is kind of interesting. So anyway,
his audio tapes were a trip.
And he's still at it, which is funny. He's still at it.
Yeah.
The funniest thing I remember about him is the goofy ties he used to wear, and I made a joke with him yesterday about it, and because he did not have a goofy tie on, but I remember every time I'd meet him back then, 20 plus years ago, he'd always be rocking the goofiest looking tie as there was. So
he was never afraid to be Ron.
No. So in any event, not to divert the show there. I appreciate the background on yourself, Steve. So maybe again, tell us a bit about FIG. Fourplex Investment Group. You guys have a unique offering. It's a fairly unique business in the world that we're in today. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about it, the background, kind of what was the catalyst of forming and focusing on fourplexes. And then we'll talk about all the other details, such as, the markets that you guys are in, pros and cons and such.
Sure. Yeah. FIG had its inception in 2010. And if you recall, Kevin, in 2010, If you were buying land, people wanted to have you committed. It was an absolutely crazy time to be buying land and
Mm-hmm.
developing. But, clearer eyes can look into the past and realize, wow, what a time to have been buying land. I should have done it more, right? And it was prior to my involvement with FIG. I got in about 2014, 2015. But the original principals, Steve and Mike are the names. They had this idea that there's a lot of capital on the sidelines and it wants somewhere safe to go. And a fourplex can be a uniquely safe asset because it has many of the components of a small commercial deal, i.e. multiple streams of income, but you get that true 30-year fixed rate Fannie Mae financing. Nobody's calling your loan due every 7 or 10 years. If you make your payment, no one's asking any questions on a fourplex. So in that sense, it's a lot more recession resistant than some other assets. And that was the thought, is why don't we go try to do that? And so after a couple of small communities, we're talking 10 duplexes here, 10 duplexes there, the idea was, can we do this more, right? Can we do a bigger community, put an HOA over the top of it? Because if I build 50 fourplexes and I have different owners on all of them, got to have the HOA or that place is going to turn into the hood really quick, right? And believe me, we've had plenty of battles around that in our experience. But yeah, the first big community was done and underway in 2013. I came around shortly thereafter, and about when I started taking hold in FIG, the thought was, well, why just Utah? Can't this be done elsewhere? I mean, it's the same kind of financing. What markets make sense? Because frankly, Kim, we got lucky. Most people that look into the Salt Lake City metro say, wow, that's a great market. There's a lot of great things about it. We were lucky. It just happened to be our home market. But from there, it's, well, what is similar about this place that we can apply in other places? And we liked the north side of the Houston metro. That was the next place we went. We really liked Boise. And while that has turned out to be great for our investors, and we really loved Phoenix. We went in there more recently, but we've got a lot of doors coming up out of the ground in Phoenix right now. So it really is meant to capitalize on that kind of that edge where commercial and residential come together, so you can get benefits from both of them and be a fee simple investor, right? You own the fourplex, right? I'm in a couple of syndications myself. They have a great place in things. Sometimes people say, well, I don't want to be beholden to the sponsor on when they're going to liquidate. And so a fourplex says, you can do it. It's yours. And it's even kind of become more broad from there, Kevin. And there have been a few projects where the city gets some idea in their head. Well, we want apartments here, or we want bigger buildings. And so sometimes we plat these as 20 plexes or even larger. And so people will come in and do them like a true pre-construction commercial apartment deal. They'll just own one of the 20 plexes in our master planned community. And then even more recently, I kind of led the way on this. I partnered, I'm the general partner on a 32-door townhouse project in Phoenix, and it's just one entity. We took down the whole thing. So it's a little bit more like what you're probably used to. And we've got a bunch more of those on the horizon, as we've been noticing that some of these parcels that can hold 30, 50, or even 80 units are available. And many of these institutional people, skip over them. And it's not as much of a dogfight to get them locked down. Now, it is a dogfight, but it's not as bad. So that's kind of a summary snapshot of where FIG started and kind of where it's headed and where it is now.
Okay, fantastic. I appreciate that. And how have things differed, if at all? What have you seen over the past year and a half as we've worked through this pandemic? Have you seen demand for your product decline? Has it increased? And then what other changes have happened to your business? I mean, what other adaptations have you guys had to make to kind of work through, again, the last year and a half of the pandemic?
Man, the last year and a half, I don't know, where do you start with that, right?
That's a lot to unpack.
I do. Yeah. I remember in March, my wife and I were lucky. We were on our way back from Bora Bora, and there was this news about this virus thing over in China somewhere. And I remember there was a lady on the plane coughing, and we were all about ready to throw her off the plane somewhere into the Pacific. We
Coughing
go,
on
what
planes,
is going on?
coughing on planes is no longer allowed at all. So,
Yep, not cool. You need to just
unfortunately,
suffocate yourself.
I'm wondering what allergy season is going to look like in this country when folks are on that plane that don't have the coronavirus and they're coughing or sneezing due to allergies. So time will tell.
Oh yeah, I know. We've all had a drink of water at the restaurant. It went down the wrong pipe, coughed, and had the whole place look at us, with that evil eye. So the coughing is out of style for sure. But I think they locked things down about 2 days after we landed, and it was about 6 weeks of pure damage control because nobody knew anything about what was going on. But the problem is people were making decisions as if they did know. Mm-hmm. And so it was just a lot of mayhem and keeping track of that. We had investors bailing out of contracts left and right. We kept telling them, look, there's a shock phase that's happening. People are panicked. This will settle down, hang with us. Ironically, we had 2 Fourplex projects we launched at the time, and we couldn't get anybody to talk to us. I said, no, later. I don't know what I'm doing. The world might be over. And so I said, go buy bullets and gold, I guess, and we'll see you later. I don't know what to tell you. But then something crazy happened. It started to perk up a little bit in late April. But I don't know why, Kevin, but when May 1st hit, the switch flipped and nobody cared anymore. And I'm talking from an investor standpoint. They drew the conclusion that, oh my goodness, these vacancies, this rash of evictions and non-payment of rent doesn't appear to be arriving. And people are buying homes and renting like crazy. At least they were in our markets. And it wasn't all even, right? But over about a 90-day period, it did become so. And from there, it's been absolutely insane. We've sold every Fourplex project we've done, and we could sell it 5 more times because there's such a tremendous demand for hard assets and a cap rate in this macroeconomic environment of still what is kind of some uncertainty. But real estate, especially multifamily, has proven to be quite robust, and everybody wants in. And that has since kind of led to a whole new set of problems, mostly with supplies, labor, and land. So we have all the demand we could ever want. We can't fill it. I was telling you as we were chatting, the problem with land right now is that sellers know they have something extremely valuable on their hands. So if you're going to tie up land to build on and you want a big, long due diligence period, there's going to be a lot of hair on that land. It's going to be problematic, and the seller is going to know it, because if they're not, they're going to want to give you 30 or so days because that land's worth more in 30 days than it is now. And so you have to be extremely confident going into these deals that you're going to be able to make the land work, because that time to get approved entitlements and so on is just not there, at least in our markets. It's extremely difficult. So that's a big difference we've noticed. And then it's not a secret to you, materials. That lockdown we did it's turning out to be a problem. And that's a multidimensional issue, of course, but sure. I'm speaking about it strictly in terms of the supply chain and the disruption that it caused. It caused a disruption to the supply chain at a time when the demand exploded. Yes. It was the perfect storm. And so we see this come in waves with different kinds of products. A few months back, we were really sweating it on OSB, particle board, plywood, right? That kind of stuff. Yep. Right now, a big pain in our butt is floor and roof trusses. It's not necessarily the lumber for them. It's the brackets that attach them together. Paint is a problem. Baseboard is a problem. Until about 60 days ago, it was a mix and match on appliances. We were putting in whatever we could get. You would see a Frigidaire and a Crosley and a Whirlpool in one unit because that's what we could get. So that's evened out somewhat, but it's all over the place. If it's not one thing, it's another. I think it's going to take a while longer to even out. And then, the same thing with labor. These guys are getting poached off of job sites. Well, this builder told me they'd pay me X, and then you got to go steal them back, and it just keeps raising the pay on these guys.
Yeah.
So we're even, trying to get as long a construction loan terms as we can, just knowing there's going to be a lot more to sort through than there normally is.
And so just to get a general sense of how all this, how all those, those challenges associated to the pandemic have affected your business, give us a general indication of what that did to pricing, for the, you just pick one of your random projects that you're currently, you were in the process of completion during the pandemic, and maybe you're just finishing up now that, you were selling, you were building for, per unit or selling per unit for X number of dollars. And ultimately over the last 6 months, what have you, it's increased to, this amount per unit. Give me a general idea of what that looks like. What percentage of have we seen these prices inflate?
Well, that's a good question, because it depends on whether title has changed hands for us or not. Because in our purchase agreement, we do a pre-construction deal. So if, Susie, the attorney, closes on a lot with us and then has a build contract in place, she has closed, and that's now a fixed bid contract.
God, okay.
The only two things that we could go back to Susie for are acts of God and municipal action. So if an earthquake comes and knocks the whole thing over, we say, hey, sorry, Susie, we didn't have an earthquake built into our budget, right? Mm-hmm. Or some city ordinance gets too aggressive and says, you didn't have to put in fire suppression, but now you do, and we don't care. And that costs you a lot more money. But other than that, lumber costs spiking, labor costs spiking, we've got to eat it. So wow. There are 3 projects right now where I think the profit is gone because we have to perform on those fixed bid contracts. And, we cried about that one and got over it. Now we're moving. It's fine. There were 2 others where we had not closed on construction loans yet, and our investors had these fourplexes reserved. And I hated doing it, but we had to go back to them. We raised the price on, if I recall, the purchase price was around $700 on a project in Idaho and around $800 on one in Arizona. And we raised one of them $48,000 and another $25,000. Mm-hmm. That appeared to not be enough at first. Lumber has backed off some, but all those other problems are still there. So, that's probably what, a 7% bump in prices, and we could have done more. Mm-hmm. And just as a matter of perspective, we're about to start marketing a new fourplex project in Ogden, Utah. The base price of those is going to be $940.
Wow. Okay.
So you can see that comparison. It's a pretty big jump.
Yeah, it's interesting. I made the assumption, which I shouldn't have done. So I assumed that maybe the business model existed as though that you guys completed the project and got it occupied and then simply sold it as a turnkey unit. But it doesn't sound like that's the case. I think you have multiple other ancillary and complementary services that you guys arrange as far as property management and what have you. But again, I made an assumption that maybe it was a turnkey project that was being sold at the end. So maybe let's back up then and let our listeners know exactly how FIG works. What does that process look like from a consumer's perspective?
Yeah, and sometimes that does happen, what you just described, where a property is built, stabilized, and then we sell it at full value. But part of the way that the business model really works for investors out there is it deals with this issue of the cap rate compression, which, as we know, they're just ridiculously low almost across the board. And so when we think about how do I buy with a better cap rate, it goes to the issue that I said, you got to find a deal with some hair on it. You got to solve some problems. And I would imagine that's a lot what you talk about with your listeners. Somebody buys an apartment complex and it's old and tired, built in 1973, and it needs to be rewired and re-roofed and get a whole cosmetic facelift, and you got to move half the tenants out and evict a bunch of others. But the idea is when it's all said and done, you bring rent up a couple $100 a door, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a whole process to do. And when you do a FIG deal, we jokingly call it, well, this is the armchair value add. You don't have to go do all that, but it's essentially done, but it's done for you. So what happens, FIG puts land under contract. We move through the development process. We get these lots to permit ready. All right, they're ready to pull permits and go vertical. So a client reserves that lot, and when it's time to start construction, they put 25% down and they close on a construction loan. So they're now the owner of the land. And our builder team has a construction loan to draw from as they build the fourplex for those investors. Mm-hmm. And so the investor has to, they have to wait for us to finish with development. They've got to wait for construction to happen, lease up to happen, all of those things. Now, you wouldn't do that unless there was a cherry on top for you, right? Otherwise, you just say, well, I'm going to wait till it's done and buy it then when all the risk is out of it and it's fully occupied and brand new, mm-hmm. right? So that's how we line up 50 of these people that are willing to wait for a year or two because they're getting a cap rate that's better. We're selling it at, typically these days, like a 6 to 6.5, when the market delivers a 5. It's just a fancy way of saying there's some equity out of the chute. Yep. If you're willing to take the time to understand and put up with that construction and stabilization process.
Got it. That makes sense. So roughly 6 to 6.5 cap, depending on the market. That's where you're at today?
Yeah. It depends on a few things, but that's a fair range. Yes.
Okay. And what is, from the time that ground is broken till lease up is completed, on average, I know that every project's a little different than the next, every market's different than the next, but what can a buyer typically expect from beginning to a fully occupied cash flowing unit?
Yeah, I would say that like 15 months from when you close on your construction loan to when you're fully stabilized is fair. Okay. 12 months of that is the actual construction, and then some cleanup, get it on the market, and then the leases start dropping in there, right? And at the time of year, what's the market doing, or a few small variables, but it wouldn't swing it too wildly either direction, except in very extreme cases.
Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming you have the construction financing lined up, and is it a fairly easy transition from that construction to a permanent loan when that time comes?
We've got a lender that does it for you. He's the one that sets up the construction loan. So he has your whole file, just needs to get updated tax returns and financials. And then he takes it to, your traditional Fannie Mae takeout loan, right? So as an example, I closed on 2 myself last year. I ended up refining out of my construction loan, and I think it's Fifth Third Bank that has the long term on those.
Got it. How about any pros and cons? Let's make the comparison between the typical fourplex to a commercial multifamily, so 5+ units, and just kind of run through with the listeners, some of the pros and cons of one versus the other, if you would.
I've often heard people, and I think mistakenly, say that, well, you should buy commercial properties because the lender doesn't care about you, they just care about the property. Now, anybody who's gone to loan committee knows that's not true.
Sure.
Right? But it's also fair to say it is a lot more about the property, right? If you're semi-competent, maybe you've got some operating history, they're not looking at your personal debt to income ratios as much, right? Imagine if they held you to that on commercial deals, but nobody would qualify ever. The debt is so enormous. So the pro to the commercial is, look, if you've got a good debt coverage ratio, you've got a good track record, good partners, you could buy lots and lots of deals, and that's great. If you've got a lot of capital to deploy, you are going to end up in the commercial space before you know it. You don't have a choice, right? Now, if you're an employee, you make a few $100,000 a year, you've got $200,000 to invest, and you want to control it. The pro to a fourplex is you can get up to 10 of these conforming loans, right? It's the same kind of mortgage you get for your house that you live in, but you just put a little bit more down, 25%. It's meant for 1 to 4 unit properties. A big advantage there is that full 30-year amortizing loan, right? On our commercial deal, those are going to amortize over 20, 25 years, sometimes 30 or better, it depends. Yep. But they're usually due in 10 years. So every 10, you're on the hook for a refi or paying it off or selling it. Not so with the fourplex. So it's you're able to because you never want to be caught trying to refi or sell in a down market, right? With a fourplex, you can basically say, "Do I have 30 years?" Right? I don't know. Do you? And then that's what your time frame is like, and so you can just pick the most opportune time on that 30-year timeline to liquidate, right? So they both have their pros and cons. A lot of our investors have maxed out their 10 Fannie Mae loans.
Mm-hmm.
They have 40 doors under their belt. Some of them are extra crafty, and a spouse qualified separately, and they got another 40 under their belt that way. And now they're happy with that, and they stop. Or others say, I've got a great resume. I can easily get commercial, and I'm going to buy 10 fourplexes as a package, for example. So I would never say that one is better than the other. It really just kind of depends on your situation, and hopefully that was some insight as to the pros and cons.
No, that's great. I appreciate that. And where is Fannie at today on non-owner occupied rates? What could one expect?
Well, on a 2 to 4 unit, so they'll treat a single usually different, but on a 2 to 4 unit, the rate would probably be right around in the high 3s, maybe right at 4.
Okay.
Depends on your FICO score and a few other things.
And then how does Fannie? I know that typically in a owner occupied or even non-owner occupied with Fannie, they're going to be looking at the debt to income ratio. Do they look at the 2 to 4 unit loans slightly different than that of a single unit non-owner occupied or owner occupied residence? I mean, are they giving any consideration at all to the income that the property is generating, or is it solely based on?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Yeah, and I might butcher this. You're probably going to get hate mail from a bunch of loan officers. So that guy doesn't know what he's talking about, but I'll take a stab at it. Many times borrowers don't need the income from the property. If their debt to income is okay, then nobody cares. But if it's a little skinny, right, the debt to income ratio is tight, I believe they can use 75% of the projected rental income to offset that debt payment.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that maybe one, it should be pretty straightforward for most folks that earn a decent living. But when you start buying, the second one, the third one, if they're not factoring in any of the income from that property, unless you're, a high income earner that earns, $500,000 or $1 million a year in ordinary income, then you're going to start running into some challenges, assuming that you've also got your primary residence and other things kind of working against you. So,
you're going to need those to show up on your tax returns for a few years, so they can definitely see where that income's coming from and be happy. If you haven't filed your taxes with a fourplex on there yet, then you're just showing a brutal debt to income ratio. So it might just take you a little bit more time to get there, or you just got to come in with more down. That's a great way to solve debt to income.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Steve, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here, and I've got a question. It's a little bit more of a personal question from you and your experience being a real estate investor. And everyone likes to talk about the best deal they've ever done, the one they made the most money on, the one that had the highest returns, right? All the rosy deals, I guess you could say. But very few folks like to really discuss and be vulnerable about the deals that they lost sleep over, lost hair over, got gray hairs, what have just the challenging deals, the one that just added just a massive amount of stress to your life. And so when I speak to that, is there one deal that comes to mind, a real estate deal over the 20 or so years that you've been doing real estate? Any deal that comes to mind as the most challenging? If so, what was it? What were the challenges associated with it, and how'd you overcome them? And then ultimately, what would you have done differently going back around the table the second time?
I lost some properties in the downturn back in 2008. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there was anything wrong with the properties. This was a batch of single family homes outside of Dallas, Texas. And I was young and stupid at the time. We've all been young and stupid. Many of us are still young and still stupid. But I was just really sloppy. I went in and I didn't put anything down because they would actually let you back then, right? And so I didn't have a lot of skin in the game. And then things kind of went sideways in one of my other businesses, and I had to surrender the properties. If you go in with a good down payment, you're actually an investor. you have a dog in the fight, and you're able to weather that storm. I went in with no money down, and I spent a bunch of money on other things and other investments, and I didn't stay liquid.
Mm-hmm.
I would probably still own those properties today if I would have stayed liquid. I would have been able to get through those short-term bumps in the road, but I panicked. They're calling me for payments. They're mad. I surrendered the properties, and I let emotion run the day. I since have seen in real estate that if you've got reserves and you understand that what is happening today is not the end of the line,
Mm-hmm.
things can and do change over time. And I would say that in real estate, they always get better over time. Sometimes you might need to lengthen the timeline, but if you've got those reserves, you'll stay in, and that has stuck with me. Just because a bank will give you a loan doesn't mean you should take it.
Very valid point. I agree with that. Yeah, no, it's speaking back to 2008, I had a lot of challenges as well, and I think that having reserves, I absolutely agree with that. It just I guess it really depends on 2008 was unique in that I think it was so dramatic that folks just didn't know when it was going to end, and so a lot of our properties were down here in Florida, and we had fairly conservative leverage points, which what we would expect it to be conservative, in the 60 to 65% range, but within a matter of 6 to 8 months, there was negative equity. The market crashed that hard in certain parts of the country. So, and then not knowing how long that was going to last, right? Like, how long did those reserves really have to last to weather that storm? And, it's kind of like it's interesting because it's looking back at the pandemic, the start of it, everyone was like, oh God, put the brakes on. Like literally, the world might be ending right now. Let's take a month or two and figure this out. What's going to ultimately happen? What's going to be the outfall from this? And I think the same kind of emotional feelings played out at the start of 2008, but yet they lasted a lot longer, right? I think they actually lasted probably for a lot of folks, especially if you're in real estate. If you owned real estate and you're having a challenging time, you're talking about a couple of years. We were like, oh man, like this has already gone on for a year or two, and so how much longer is it really going to last until we truly hit the bottom and actually start seeing that dip and come back up the other side? And for most markets, it took 3+ years before that event actually occurred. So in any event, I think that were some of the challenges that we had on our side going through that is really trying to make an educated decision of, do we keep throwing good money after bad, and at what point in time are the reserves depleted, and ultimately we still lose the properties?
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's really hard to see the forest through the trees at that point.
I've had to come to peace with, because if you went through, sounds like we had similar experiences, and it was a while before I was ready to come out and play again.
Me too.
Yeah, it was rough, man. And at some point you have to come to peace with the fact that, okay, I have very reasonable reserves. Not one expert on earth would tell me, hey, you're being irresponsible. But if your number's up, your number's up, right? You're an investor. There's risk in the game. And if you don't take any, you're never going to benefit. And so you just have to realize that, look, I've done everything I can. I'm being as smart as I can. And at some point, what's going to happen is what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting is that I think one of the biggest mistakes I've ever made looking back was that you mentioned, like, it took a couple years for you to want to come out and play again, right? Like it's kind of backed out of real estate, just kind of, stood in the shadows for a period of time before you're ready to jump back in. And I think that was probably, looking back, that was probably one of the bigger mistakes that we made is I wish we would have stayed focused on the challenges we were having, but not so focused that we weren't willing to look at all the potential benefits that will come out of the other side, meaning like additional opportunities, right? The rest of the world was having the same challenges, and that was ultimately going to create opportunities on the buying side. And that's the last thing we wanted to think about was buying, because we were in, devastation mode, right? Damage control mode. And I think that we missed some incredibly prime years of buying real estate at pennies on the dollar. We started buying it in 2011. So it wasn't, 3 years, not too bad. 2011, 2012, kind of bought a couple properties here, a couple properties there, but we're still very cautious. Whereas looking back, again, in hindsight, we would have been buying the world at that point, but I wasn't ready to get my head.
And a few guys did, and yeah. A few guys did, and hats off to them, right? I
Yep.
love the movie The Big Short,
Yep.
the people that saw it coming. But I'll speculate briefly, but people think, are we gonna is the market gonna go down? And the answer is, well, yes, at some point it goes down,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm skeptical that it would be as severe. There's always some kind of a weird black swan event that you don't know, but I'm skeptical it would be as severe as '08 because we got a lot of salty veterans with dry powder
Yeah.
that
Mm-hmm.
that now understand, oh yeah, well, what goes down must come up, and they're ready to pounce, and they would probably soak up that inventory at not as deep of a discount because there would be competition. I remember going to the courthouse steps back in '09, 2010, and nobody was there, and there were all the properties in the world. But after a couple of years, the foreclosure auctions were just crazy, absolutely crazy. People on Bluetooth talking to Hong Kong, right? I got this. How much you want to go? Right? It was nuts.
Yeah, times have definitely changed, and they've changed very quickly over this past
Yeah.
decade. But well, Steve, appreciate you coming on here. For folks that want to learn more about Fig and the different offerings you guys have and new projects coming online, where's the best place to find you?
We've got a lot of great information on our website about how it all works and how to get involved. If you feel like it's a good opportunity for you, it's easy. Just go to Fig, so Fig like the fruit, .us, fig.us.